Our concluding presentation this afternoon is by Dr. Pat Westhoff. Pat is the director of FAPRI and a professor in Ag Econ department here at the university, and he's going to speak on the socioeconomic reality. So we're going to get dragged into the real world here of recent floods and droughts. Pat?
Thanks a lot, Mike, for the introduction. Thanks, Shibu, for the invitation today. And thank all of you for sticking around this long. As you can tell by the topic listed here, I could probably talk a lot more than half an hour on this, to put it mildly. So I'm going to narrow this down a bit. I'm going to focus a bit just on the crop sector and the livestock sector, what that might mean through the final consumer of food. So we're going to talk about food sector stuff today. So how does adverse weather affect crop production? How do changes in crop production therefore affect the prices of those commodities? What's that mean for the livestock sector? What does it mean for final food consumers? So let's have a little audience participation up front here. It's been a long day. You've heard lots of people yelling at you all day. What's wrong with this picture? By the way, I'm from Northeast Iowa, about 15 miles away from the Field of Dreams. What's wrong with this picture? Smart people in this audience should know. I'll give you one hint. The movie was released in 1989. That means the movie was shot in 1988. Cornfields would not have looked like that in Iowa on their own in 1988. That took a little bit of help from some water being applied that would not normally be applied in Northeast Iowa. One thing that I missed entirely, but a colleague of mine pointed out, you can't see maybe it's too well in this room. What's wrong with that? That's not field corn, folks. No. That's sweet corn. That's because I was supposed to be field corn. That's not really, that's sweet corn, I'm sorry. Anyway, so corn, that's leading me into talking about the drought and what that might mean. If we look back at U.S. average corn yields going back to the year 1980, it's not too hard to find the adverse weather effects that have occurred several years in the past. We had the 1983 drought when the national average corn yield was 81 bushels an acre. 88 drought was 85 bushels an acre. The 93 floods was 101 bushels an acre. And of course, the drought this past year, where the current estimate's 122 bushels an acre. We'll get a final estimate from USDA on Friday. And we'll see what they have to say about the final crop yield for 2012. You see our all-time record high was 165 bushels per acre back in 2009. So we've had 1, 2, 3 straight years of below trend yields for corn. I guess technically speaking, given the way I drew my trend line here, that was also true in 1995, 96, and 97, but those are very small deviations from trend. This is the first time in a long time where we've had multiple years in a row of sharp drops from the long-term trend. In a 2012 drought, at least given the current estimates of this year's crop, we were 39 bushels per acre less than the long-term trend. That's 24% below the trend. 88 drought in comparison is about 24.5% lower than the trend. So we'll see where the final numbers come out on Friday, whether this was or was not the worst year relative to the trend in a long time in the case of corn. So that's U.S. corn. Here's Missouri corn, same type of story. So again, 83 drought, 88 drought, 93 floods, and 2012 drought. Again, we'll see what the final numbers prove to be on Friday, but the current estimate is they were 49% below trend for the state as a whole. If it weren't for the boot heel in northwest Missouri, it'd be even more than that. The average estimated yields here in central Missouri were in the order of 47 bushels an acre this past year. So just an incredibly terrible year for crop production in this state. All-time record high in Missouri was 2004. So it's been 8 years since we hit the record here in Missouri. That's corn in Missouri. And here's back to national levels for soybeans. So again, 83 drought, 88 drought, 93 flood. Now we'll throw in the 2003 drought for soybeans. Didn't show up in corn because in corn, most of that crop had been made by the time the drought hit in late summer of 2003, where soybean yields were affected. And again, the 2012 drought. We were about, the average growth is about half a bushels per year. We're about 12% below the trend this past year, and that compares to 17% below back in 1983, or 88, I should say, 88. Okay, so here's our complicated economics for the day. Got that? Demand curve sloped down. If you had Econ 101, you should know this. It's not hard. If you have less of something, all else equal, the price will be higher. All else is not always equal, but all else equal, lower quantity produced in this case will mean higher prices. So let's think about how this actually applies, and it does seem to work pretty well the last several years. In 2009, the national average yield of corn, 165 bushels an acre. 153, 147, 122 the last 3 years running here. There's our production levels nationally, a little bit different than just the yield effects. Of course, they have different acreage planted each year. But the price of corn from 355 in 2009, 518 in 2010, 622 in 2011, and for the first 4 months of this marketing year, $6.92. USDA is actually estimating a higher average price for the year as a whole. See how things play out the rest of the year. So sure enough, lower yields, higher prices. And note again, we're talking about a price this year that's almost double what the price was as recently as 2009. There have not been huge shifts in international demand. There have not been huge shifts in biofuel use, et cetera, that can explain this. This is primarily less quantity means higher prices. Okay, now show that we're really smart folks at FAPRI. We do this for a living. We got tired of being wrong all the time when we do our projections, because we don't know what the weather's going to be from year to year. So when we do projections for the next 10 years, we're always wrong. So let's try to hedge our bets. So we'll draw from our hat different weather. We'll draw from our hat different demand for different products, et cetera. And sure enough, if you look back at our solutions that we did last January for what we thought might happen with corn markets during the current market year, the year that we're in right now, we did 500 possible outcomes for that year. And for those 500 possible outcomes, yes, indeed, 2 of those 500 outcomes had yields about where we ended up and prices about where it appear like we're going to end up as well. So that means one of 2 things. Either last year was really a 1 in 250 year event, or we need to go back and look at our distributions probably this next time we do a baseline. And I think after listening to folks today talking about perhaps broader distributions in front of us, I know what the answer is probably going to be. We'll go back and look at our distributions again as we get to do this exercise one more time in 2 weeks for the 2013 year. If you average all those different things that could have happened this past year, we were saying that the average yield we thought was going to be 162 bushels an acre. And that would have resulted in a price of about $4.80 a bushel. Now, mind you, a more yield doesn't necessarily mean lower prices. Other things affect prices from year to year as well. But definitely a downward sloping demand curve, if you will, traced out by that. If we had normal weather last spring and summer, we would have much, much lower corn prices than we have today. It would be a very different world than we live in right now. So let's add one more line to our previous chart. So the top 3 lines is what you saw before. And all I've done now is do some very simple math. I'm just taking this yield, multiplied by this price. And that's going to give me this revenue per acre. So on a national average basis, the average corn farmer in 2009 got about $584 by selling their corn. $584 per acre for selling their corn. 2010, we have a lower yield, but we have a higher price. And in fact, the price went up a lot more than the yield went down. The demand was inelastic, all else equal, I would suggest. And sure enough, the revenue increased. So a lower yield was associated with a higher revenue in 2010. The same thing in 2011. Further drop in yields in 2011 compared to 2010. Price went up again. Price went up more than yield went down. And so for the 2011-2012 crop year, we had an all-time record in terms of what that corn crop was worth on a per acre basis, $915. Now we'll see again where final numbers turn out for the current year. Again, 122 is USDA's current estimate. They may revise it on Friday. The 692 is the first 4 months of the year. Could be higher, could be lower for the year as a whole. We'll see how it plays out. But given what we know right now, we're talking about $846 per acre this year. Not quite as high as last year's record, but still higher than any previous year. So second highest ever. So in spite of the worst drought by some measures since 1988, by some other measures going back to maybe even the 1950s, we're talking about revenues per acre for the average corn farm in the United States that are the second highest ever this year, just from selling their crop. Now, if you're somebody who has nothing to sell, if you have no crop whatsoever, who cares what the price is? And here in central Missouri, there were folks who had nothing to sell. But national average, that's how the numbers come out. Now let's add 2 more lines. Let's add government payments, and let's add crop insurance benefits. Now, at the kind of prices we've had the last several years, the only government payment that's of relevance is what's called the direct payment. You get that every year, no matter what you plant, no matter what the price of corn is, doesn't matter. It's about $23 an acre. It was $24 per acre in 2009 because it was one other small payment that averaged $1 per acre nationally in 2009. So that's how much farmers are getting from Uncle Sam if they have corn-based acreage on their farm, okay, on a per acre basis. Then let's add crop insurance net indemnities, or indemnities I should say. So farmers have to pay a premium in the springtime. They're paying about 38% on average of the actuarial cost of that premium. Taxpayers are covering the rest. And the indemnity is how much they got on average back because of losses on their farm. Obviously, many producers would have gotten zero in any given year. Now, on average, most producers do get zero in a given year. But averaging across all producers, some had losses, some didn't. $14 per acre was the average loss that got compensated in 2009. $20 in 2010, $35 last year, and so far as of this week, $68 per acre have gone out the door already, and there's more payments to come. I won't predict the final number, but it'll be definitely more than 68. So by the time you add 846 plus 24 plus 68, yeah, you're still lower than last year, but not by as much as you were before. And in fact, there will actually be producers this year who harvested no crop at all, who will make more money than they would have had everybody in the country harvest a normal crop. Because if everybody harvested a normal crop, the price would not be $6.92. The price would be a lot less than that. And the way crop insurance works, you get compensated at the higher of the planting price or the harvest price. So the compensation was based on a price value even higher than that, like $7.40 was the price that the compensation is based upon. And so that's actually a good thing for folks who had the right kind of crop insurance and marketed their crop in the right way. Lots of Missouri corn farmers, even though they had very poor crops, may not have a bad income picture this year for crop producers. So again, summarizing, if you are the only person around who has a problem, you're stuck. If there was just a localized flood or drought that affected you and you alone, or just you and your neighbors, you have reduced crop yields, prices don't change if it's just you and your neighbors, so therefore you get less from selling your crops, and maybe you do or you don't get a crop insurance benefit to help out at least a little bit. If there is a widespread flood or drought like we've had the last 3 years in a row now in this country, yes, crop yields go down, but prices go up, and prices can go up as much or more than yields go down. So indeed, in a short crop year, it is possible that farmers can make more money than they would had it been a normal year for everybody. You may or may not see incomes go up or down depending on what's happening elsewhere in the world, frankly. And yes, you'll also get crop insurance indemnities as well. Okay, so that's the crop sector in a nutshell. So here's what does this mean for users of corn now? And the same would be true for most other commodities, but I pick corn because it's a nice, neat story. Based on USDA's current estimates as of last month for what we might have in store for us for this market year for corn, everything makes sense. We got less production this year by a fair amount. We have 1.6 million bushels less corn produced this year than last year, and far lower than we would have had we had a normal crop this year. We could have been looking at a 14 billion bushel corn crop had we had good yields this year. So in order to make sure that limited production went and made it through the year, prices had to rise enough to convince livestock feeders to cut the amount of corn they're going to feed to livestock, to convince ethanol users to not use as much corn in making ethanol, to convince other folks to use it for cereals, for HFCS, for other, all sorts of other products, to reduce those uses a little bit as well. And it looks like we're going to export less corn this year as well because of the higher prices. And we'll have less corn in storage at the end of the year. So every single one of those categories adjusts in the way you'd expect it to adjust to higher prices. Everybody who can find a way to economize does so. Everybody who can find a substitute does so. And the livestock sector is going to be hurt. We'll talk about that in a second, meaning less livestock production implications for consumers as well. Again, the average price by USDA last month was estimated at $688. We're lower than that now. We'll see where we end up for the year as a whole. So now let's talk about the livestock sector effects a bit. Or the overall system. So again, less for human consumption, less for feed, less for fuel, less is kept in storage. How much each sector adjusts depends on what kind of substitutes are available and whether or not something is elastic or inelastic. How responsive are users to prices? If you're talking about making cereal or making corn chips, that's going to be pretty inelastic. The price doesn't really matter too much. We're going to sell, Tostitos in the store, regardless of how much the price of corn is. But if on the other hand, you're someone who's deciding whether to use corn or something else as a livestock feed, and if there were a more competitive price product out there, you might switch to another feed if you can. But as we'll see, all the grain prices went up at the same time. Not many great substitutes out there for folks. Okay, ethanol industry, let's talk about that for a second. So one of the areas that we saw reduced use of corn this year is expected to be the ethanol industry. And year-to-date numbers do confirm that we're using less corn to make ethanol so far this marketing year. Last year, we produced about 13.8 billion gallons of ethanol in this country. We're currently estimating about 12.5 billion gallons. We'll do some new estimates here in a couple weeks. Why I see in the back? Yes, no, who knows? That's probably in the ballpark. We're going to be down about, a significant amount this year, looks like. Okay, to adjust for that, though, note that when we get down to domestic use of ethanol, almost no change. It was about 13 billion gallons in 2010-11. It was about 13 billion gallons last year, and we're projecting right now about 13 billion gallons for this year. So how can you have production down by that much, by 1.3 billion gallons, but actually have increased consumption? Well, this thing called trade. We're importing more ethanol this year from Brazil primarily, and we're exporting less ethanol this year. Last year, we were actually exporting ethanol to Brazil. Let me repeat that. We were exporting ethanol to Brazil last year. Ethanol has a large domestic use of ethanol. They needed the anhydrous ethanol we produce for their cars that use a blended fuel as opposed to those who use straight ethanol, and they were actually buying ethanol from us. This year, the situation has reversed, in part because of policy, not just because of economics. Note that the price of ethanol is actually lower so far this year than it was last year. We'll see where we end up on the year. We may end up higher, who knows, but we're not talking about a significant increase in ethanol prices in spite of higher corn prices. So what does that mean? Ethanol plants, they were clearing 70 cents per gallon over the cost of their corn a couple years ago, and made 37 cents per gallon last year over the cost of their corn and other inputs, are probably roughly a break even this year. That's why some plants are shut down. This is an average across all plants, meaning some plants are losing money. Plants are losing money, don't produce ethanol. So that's why we've seen a slowdown in production. Some plants actually have stopped or at least reduced their production for the current year. Okay, the biofuel sector, again, higher costs for feedstocks. Corn and the feedstock prices have gone up. That reduces the profitability of biofuel production, resulting in reduced production and reduced investment probably as well. But we do have policies in place that require a certain level of biofuel use. That's why in the previous chart we saw that consumption remained relatively flat. The adjustments occur primarily in trade. We've also got some obscure things called RINs, but we won't get into that today. That's more complicated than even I want to pretend. So now I'll switch over to talk about the livestock sector for a second. Again, corn prices have gone up, we saw already, so have hay prices. As anybody who's trying to raise livestock here in Missouri knows, pasture conditions have been terrible. Hay prices have gone through the roof if it's even available. On a national average basis, we're talking about hay prices this year of something like $190 per ton for all hay, much higher than that for alfalfa, not so much, of course, for lower quality hay. See how that compares to the price of corn in red? Those prices don't move in lockstep, but all else equal, higher corn prices and higher hay prices do tend to go together across time. If you're thinking about cellulosic ethanol production down the road, what's cellulosic ethanol going to be made from? Well, we'll see. If it's made from, say, miscanthus or switchgrass, and you want to grow that stuff on marginal lands that might otherwise be used for pasture hay, here's the price you're competing with, folks. You're not competing with sub-$100 hay like you were a few years ago. Right now you're competing with hay that's close to $200 a ton. You can't make cellulosic ethanol profitably if your feedstock costs close to $200 a ton, period. Okay, so the weather matters for these sort of stories as well. With those kind of feed prices, that means reduced profitability for livestock producers. We saw it very dramatically this year for pork producers, but it's true across the board. When you got reduced profitability for livestock producers, it means several things. It means people will pull back production eventually. But just because of basic biology, that can happen faster for some species than others. How long does a chicken live? A few weeks. You can adjust chicken production very quickly. Tyson, the other major producer of chicken, can say, take fewer birds in your houses, and in a few weeks you've got less chicken production. Adjustment occurs, prices go up, and voila, you're back to profit making, hopefully, in relatively short order. Hogs take longer. Pig lives longer than chicken. It may take a couple years to play that out. And if you got major players involved in the industry like we have today, maybe they're reluctant to give up too much market share in the meantime, so they'll keep producing even though they may be making losses for some period of time. They finally got cattle. takes a long time from the time a cow was bred to the time you finally got meat on the shelf. So adjustments that are occurring now will be affecting beef production 2, 3, 4 years from now. So the drought of 2010, the drought of 2011 to 2012 is going to reduce beef production not just this year, but for several years to come. And you can kind of see that in the overall numbers. Again, these are USDA estimates for 2011, for 2012, and 2013. See the decline in beef production? That's not just because of the drought of 2012, that's because the droughts of the last couple of years in Texas and elsewhere have reduced cow numbers, reduced the number of calves that have been put in the feedlots, et cetera. So production is already down this year somewhat, or in 2012 is obviously down somewhat, and in 2013 is expected to drop very, very sharply for beef this year. Pork production was actually up in 2012, much to many people's surprise, including my own. But with those higher feed costs expected to drop off a bit in 2013. Chicken production has been declining. If you told some of us 5, 6 years ago that we'd be talking about several years running of declining chicken production, we said you were crazy, because we had not seen any declines at all in chicken production like 30 years. And now we've had 2 straight years of pretty significant declines in chicken production with these higher prices. Milk production was actually up in 2012, but expected to hold relatively flat this year with the higher feed costs that dairy producers are facing. So higher prices for fed cattle, I should say, after lower prices in 2012 and very, very bad profitability, therefore, for pork producers in 2012, a little bit better picture perhaps this year. Wholesale chicken prices have been going up as well with higher feed costs, and you can see milk prices actually dipped a bit in 2012 after good profits in 2011. Lots of dairy producers took a lot of negative numbers on their balance sheets in 2012. So what's this mean for consumer food prices? So higher crop prices directly mean higher price for things made directly from crops. So vegetable oil prices will be higher than they would have been otherwise. Tortilla chips will cost more than they would have otherwise. Bread will cost more than it would otherwise. But how much corn, how much wheat, how much soybeans is really in those products? The consumer value of those products is several times as large as the farm value of the products that they're made from. So even a large proportional change in the price of corn, the price of soybeans, has only a minimal effect on the consumer cost of those types of goods. In the case of livestock products, not so much. If the price of cattle, the price of hogs, the price of chickens go up, so is the price of beef, the price of pork, the price of chicken in the grocery store. Maybe not penny for penny, but definitely we'll see it feed through to final consumers in probably a more important way than you would for some of those crop-based products. And again, on average, the farm gate value of the average food item consumed by a U.S. consumer is far less than 20%. So more than 80% of the value of the cost, if you will, of what you're paying in a grocery store, what you're paying in a restaurant, are things that happen after this stuff leaves the farm. If you think about buying a meal at a restaurant, you're primarily paying for labor. You're paying for the cost of operating the restaurant. You're not paying for the farm value of the food that you're consuming. You're paying for everything that happened after that stuff left the farm. So when you get to the final, what's this mean for consumer food prices? A lot of people in the summer were talking about runaway food price inflation. We ain't seen it yet, okay? In 2010, the average consumer food price inflation was about 0.8%. So in 2010, we had lower food price inflation than we had overall inflation in the economy. Overall inflation was 1.6%. Food prices are up 0.8%. In 2011, prices did jump quite a bit. 3.7% was the average rate of increase in food prices in 2011. The stuff we consumed at home, 4.8%, with meat being at least a very large share of that, 7.4% increase in consumer level meat prices in 2011 compared to 2010, 6.8% in the case of dairy. The drought of 2010 and 2011 helped increase beef prices, increase pork prices, increased other product prices. That made a big difference in what the final value was to consumers for those goods. This year, even though we've seen higher feed costs, we haven't seen nearly the sort of increase in meat prices year over year we saw last year. 3.8% year over year increases this year. So overall food price inflation for the first 11 months of last year was 2.7% for 2012, compared to 2.1% average rate of inflation for all goods in the U.S. economy. Now, as we go forward to 2013, I'm going to give you a projection here that's really hard because we're going to do new numbers here in just a couple weeks. But I'd expect a number that's higher than 2.7%, but probably not, maybe not higher than the 3.7% we had in 2011. So we might see a bit of an uptick in food price inflation in 2013 as the effects of the 2012 drought play themselves out. But we wouldn't expect to see runaway food price inflation. And by the way, these numbers are, yes, they're affected by the price of farm commodities, but they're also affected by price of oil, the overall health of the economy, what happens to wage rates, what happens to healthcare costs, for that matter, are all going to affect what the price of food is that you and I pay at the grocery store or at the restaurant. So summary points. Floods and droughts do reduce crop production. Surprise, surprise. This results in higher crop prices. Higher crop prices, reduce consumption by the livestock sector, reduce other uses. That means higher prices eventually for livestock products and meats, and it gets translated to consumer food costs as well. The net effect of this on U.S. consumers is relatively muted by the fact, again, that most of the value happens after things leave the farm. If, on the other hand, you're talking about a low-income consumer in, say, Central America, they're going to be very directly affected by this. The New York Times had a story just a couple of days ago about what's happened with corn prices in Guatemala. That's a place I care about. I was a Peace Corps volunteer in Guatemala many years ago, and the price of corn has increased dramatically the last couple of years. Tortillas account for something like half of all the calories consumed in Guatemala. So this is a really big deal for a country like that. But for U.S. consumers, not quite so much. With that, there's how to contact us, and I'd be happy to take a few questions.
Questions for Pat?
Very simple question. Very simple question. I don't know if the answer is simple, but at the beginning of your talk, you were talking about the impact of the recent droughts on yield versus prices, and prices go up more than yield declines. Is there a simple explanation for that?
Sure. I mean, the simple explanation is an economic one, that demand is inelastic. What do I mean by that? If you're someone who's consuming food, like most of us do, or how much are you going to increase your food consumption if the price of food goes down by 5%? Are you going to increase it by more than 5%? Probably not. I mean, most of us consume about the same amount of food. We may change which foods we consume, but overall food consumption tends to be very unresponsive to prices. So when quantities change, prices, all else equal, tend to change more. If it weren't for biofuels and weren't for the livestock sector, that would almost certainly be true. The direct human consumption of food is very unresponsive to prices. The world's consuming about the same amount of grain every year. It's grow with population growth, but it's not going to change that much. But the price will change to make sure we allocate the available supplies.
Do you expect a big increase in irrigated corn in the Midwest? In Arkansas, we're seeing a huge shift from cotton producers starting to grow corn, and those guys have irrigation equipment. They love this past couple of years. We're going to see even more of them switch over. And I just wonder, how much of the Midwest corn do you think will increase to be irrigated?
Yeah, the question was about whether we might see more irrigation occur because of what we've seen in the last couple of years. The smart aleck response is, tell me what the price of corn is going to be. If you've got $6, $7, $8 corn, you can spend more for irrigation equipment than you can when you have $2 or $3 corn. And so it's going to be a lot more attractive in the current environment than it was a couple, 3 years ago. So I'm sure there's more folks looking at irrigation now than we were looking at it previously. I think that's pretty much a given. Now we're projecting if we have more normal crops in 2013, prices could fall very hard from the levels we've been used to. We could be back below $5, below $4 for that matter, for corn prices come this fall if we have a good crop. That changes the calculus yet again. Yes, we've seen lots of folks in the South shift from cotton to corn. They've got the irrigation there to do that, no question. A problem we're seeing in some parts of the western corn belt, people have been growing corn in irrigation in places like Colorado, is that their allocations are limited now. And we may see less irrigation in 2013 just because there's not the water available in 2013, even though new people may be irrigating that weren't irrigating previously. Shibu.
Hey, Pat, you had a table there showing the gross farm income, I believe, over time.
Sure.
I'm curious to see the net farm income over
Sure.
those years.
Sure. Right. If you look at the cost of producing corn over time, overall, if I show you, I have those numbers, I don't have them with me today, but yes, we see higher costs for seed, for fertilizer, for fuel, et cetera, over this period of time. That would eat into part of those profits, no question about it. The main thing that's happened is the price of land has gone up. And so if you're someone who owns your own land, you're making more profits now than you were several years by quite a bit. And in fact, it's the fact that you are making more money than you were several years ago is why the price of land's gone up. You know, if you think you're going to have the kind of prices we have recently for the indefinite future, and if you think interest rates are going to stay at a couple percent forever, buying farmland seems like a wonderful idea. But if crop prices fall back down to earth at some point, if interest rates come back up again at some point, those land values won't be quite what they were.
So within the, the 4-year period that you have shown there, has the net income gone down or gone up or
It's
stayed
gone
the
up.
same?
No, it's definitely
actually
gone up.
going
I mean, yes, there's been increases in cost, but net income is also up. 2012 had the second highest net farm income ever, according to USDA's estimates, highest being 2011. And in fact, if you just focus on the crop sector, that would really be true. It's only because of losses on the livestock side that it's not as even higher than it was.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Okay, well, let's thank Pat.